It began not with a coronation, but with a cradle. Not with the ringing of church bells for triumph, but with the hushed cries of a nation watching its crown slide onto the head of an infant who could not yet speak her own name. In December 1542, in the cold stone chambers of Linlithgow Palace in Scotland, a 6-day-old baby girl inherited a kingdom drenched in blood, faction, and betrayal. Mary, daughter of James V and Mary of Guise, was proclaimed sovereign of Scotland before she had even opened her eyes long enough to see the world she was meant to command. The scene was a paradox so grotesque it bordered on tragic theatre. Nobles bowing to a swaddled child, priests murmuring prayers over a creature too small to hold her own crown, and courtiers whispering schemes even as they bent their knees. This was not the triumph of a dynasty. It was the exposure of its fragility, for a realm that had long been torn by rivalries now placed its fate in the trembling hands of an infant. The death of James V had been sudden, a collapse into despair after the disastrous defeat at Solway Moss. Some chroniclers whispered that he died of a broken spirit, murmuring bitter words as he lay dying, that his house, the Stuarts, had crumbled to dust, and that he left behind only a lassie, unfit to preserve the strength of Scotland against its enemies. Whether he truly spoke those words or not, the truth remained cruel. Scotland was left leaderless, with only a newborn girl as its sovereign. And in that vacuum, the vultures circled. English eyes watched hungrily across the border, for Henry VIII saw an opportunity to bind Scotland by marriage, to fuse the two realms under Tudor dominance. Within Scotland itself, rival factions of nobles sharpened their daggers, some eager to act as protectors of the child queen, others ready to use her helplessness as a lever for their own ambition. But history is never merciful to children who inherit crowns, for Mary's infancy was never her own. From the moment she was proclaimed queen, her body became a battlefield on which men fought their wars of power and policy. Every swaddle and lullaby concealed political calculation. Every nurse and governess was chosen not merely for care, but for loyalty to one faction or another. While other children learned to crawl on stone floors, Mary learned to bear the crushing weight of expectation. She would never know the innocence of play without purpose, for her very existence was a treaty, a threat, and a promise. The image of the infant queen became both symbol and weapon. Chroniclers wrote of her beauty, of her delicate skin and lively eyes, as if nature itself had marked her for greatness. But such accounts, beneath their surface flattery, were propaganda, tools to assure a divided nobility that destiny had smiled upon Scotland, that even in helpless infancy she bore the mark of sovereignty. In portraits and pageantry, she was dressed in miniature regalia, paraded not for her own sake but for the illusion of stability her tiny presence could provide. The crown hovered above her cradle, not yet resting on her head, for she was too small to bear its weight. And yet, in the minds of her subjects, it already pressed down with all the crushing force of a nation's survival. The danger was immediate and constant. An infant monarch was a prize, and a fragile one. Assassination, abduction, foreign plots, all these dangers swirled around the cradle. The regency, led first by James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, was less a shield than a stage for rivalries to play out. Factions split between those who favoured alignment with France, through Mary's mother's Guy's family, and those who sought union with England. The infant was less ruler than hostage, and yet she carried the title of queen, her name invoked in proclamations she could not read, her seal affixed to documents she could not understand. And so the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, begins not as a tale of agency, but of imprisonment in destiny's gilded cage. She was born into a world that demanded she rule before she could walk, that she command armies before she could speak. The paradox of her reign was established from the start, a life in which her humanity would always be drowned beneath her crown. For the cradle was not sanctuary, it was a throne in disguise and one draped in blood. As Mary grew from fragile infant to a child barely able to form words, the kingdom around her convulsed with forces far larger than her cradle. To the south, Henry VIII of England saw in her existence an opening that could close the centuries-old rift between England and Scotland. He proposed what came to be known as the Treaty of Greenwich in 1543. Mary, still a babe in arms, was to be betrothed to his son Edward. It was presented as a union of peace, but in truth, it was conquest in disguise. To deliver the Queen of Scots into English hands was to surrender Scottish sovereignty to Tudor ambition. Many Scottish nobles, weary of war and hungry for alliance, at first agreed. Yet the ink on the treaty had hardly dried before the faction loyal to France and to Mary's Guise family began to resist. They saw the marriage not as salvation, but as enslavement. And so the infant queen became the center of a tug of war. Her small figure stretched between two crowns, her will irrelevant, her body already politicized. The rejection of the treaty ignited what history calls the rough wooing, a brutal campaign of fire and blood unleashed by Henry VIII upon Scotland to force compliance. English armies stormed across the border, burning villages, sacking abbeys, slaughtering peasants, all in the name of securing a bride who could not yet walk. It was a courtship by the sword, a grotesque inversion of marriage politics. The cradle had become a battlefield's prize, and Mary's very existence invited violence on her people. At the age of 2, she was already the cause of war. Meanwhile, within Scotland's borders, the regency fractured. James Hamilton, the Earl of Arran, proved weak and indecisive, shifting his allegiance between England and France as pressure mounted. Into this chaos stepped Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, a woman of formidable intelligence and unyielding will. Though foreign-born, she grasped the Scottish game quickly and recognized that her daughter's survival depended on securing allies stronger than any one faction. To protect her child from English grasp, she turned to France, invoking the ancient old alliance that bound the two nations in common cause against England. Thus, the child queen was promised not to Edward of England, but to the Dauphin of France, a decision that would shape the trajectory of her life and her tragic destiny. By 1548, when Mary was 6 years old, the choice was sealed. Scotland agreed to send its young queen across the sea to France, to be raised in safety at the French court until she was old enough to marry the heir to the Valois throne. The journey itself was perilous, for English ships prowled the waters, eager to seize her and end the question of succession by force. But she survived, spirited away under guard, her tiny frame already heavy with the weight of 2 kingdoms' ambitions. For those left behind in Scotland, her absence was both relief and loss. Relief that she was out of English reach, loss that their sovereign was a stranger raised in foreign halls. At the French court, Mary was treated less as a refugee and more as a jewel. She was educated alongside princes and princesses, tutored in languages, music, dance, theology, and statecraft. Chroniclers wrote of her beauty and grace, of her quick mind and natural charm. She flourished in an atmosphere of refinement and splendor, her every gesture polished into elegance. But beneath the glitter of the Valois court lay the truth. She was being sculpted into a weapon, a queen-in-waiting whose destiny was to bind Scotland to France in a chain of blood and marriage. Her childhood, gilded though it appeared, was still a cage. In Scotland, her absence did not bring peace. The realm bled still under the rough wooing, and the regents quarrelled endlessly. The name of Mary was invoked like an incantation, her signature affixed to decrees from across the sea, her crown a pawn in the hands of men who ruled in her stead. She was at once the most powerful and the most powerless figure in her kingdom, queen by blood, yet voiceless by circumstance. Even in France her presence was contested ground. English spies whispered of abduction, and plots swirled around her name. Her life was never her own, her cradle exchanged for a throne of promises she had not chosen. Yet there was something in Mary herself that drew loyalty. Accounts speak of her charisma, her ability, even as a child, to command affection. She was no passive figure, but a presence, luminous and haunting, as though destiny had inscribed itself upon her features. This aura, admired by courtiers and feared by enemies, would become both her gift and her curse. For charm is power, but it is also provocation, and Mary's brilliance ensured that she would never fade quietly into obscurity. The paradox remained. She had been queen since 6 days old, yet she had not ruled a single day in her own right. Her name carried armies, but her voice commanded none. She lived as an exile, a bride-to-be, a sovereign in waiting. And though she was far from Scotland's soil, her shadow loomed large over every battlefield, every council chamber, every whispered conspiracy. By the time Mary was in her teens, the vision her mother and the French court had cultivated for her was nearing completion. She was betrothed to the Dauphin, Francis, and with their union came the promise that Scotland and France would be bound by more than treaties and oaths. They would share a queen, a woman whose crown stretched across seas. When she wed Francis in 1558, it was a triumph for the Guise family and for French influence. A girl once helpless in her cradle now stood at the heart of dynastic ambition, her beauty and youth celebrated in pageantry across Paris. But fate, as ever, was cruel. Francis was frail, sickly, and within a year of ascending the French throne as King Francis II, he was dead. The magnificent dream collapsed. Mary, at 17, was a widow, Queen Dowager of France, but sovereign only in name, with little power and fewer prospects. The court that had nurtured her now regarded her as a burden, a reminder of a failed alliance, a young widow whose future no longer served French interests. And so her gaze turned back across the Channel, to Scotland, the land of her birth, the throne she had never truly sat upon, the people she barely knew. Her return in 1561 was both triumphant and ominous. The young queen, refined in the glittering courts of Europe, stepped onto the docks of Leith with the dignity of royalty and the grace of youth. Yet Scotland was no France. It was a land of stormy skies, of stubborn nobles, of fiery preachers who thundered against her Catholic faith. The Reformation had swept across the land during her absence, and the realm she inherited was fractured, divided by creed as well as clan. To the Protestants, she was a danger, a papist monarch who might drag the nation back into Rome's grasp. To the Catholics, she was hope incarnate, a beacon of faith in a hostile tide. Once again the body of Mary was the battlefield upon which men waged their wars. Still, she sought to rule with grace and compromise. Accounts tell us she tried to navigate between factions, tolerating Protestant worship even while attending her private Catholic Mass. She brought with her the polish of France, the elegance of courts far more splendid than Edinburgh, and her presence dazzled many. Poets praised her beauty, diplomats noted her wit, and nobles flocked to her court, some in loyalty, others in calculation. But no charm could mask the storm clouds gathering. Scotland was not a land that yielded easily to monarchy, much less to a young woman returning after nearly 2 decades abroad. And beyond Scotland loomed England. Mary's claim to the English throne was no small matter. As the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, she was a legitimate heir in the eyes of many Catholics, more so than Elizabeth I, whose birth was shadowed by the annulment of Henry VIII's first marriage. To Elizabeth, Mary was not merely a cousin but a rival, a living reminder of contested succession. Thus, the bond between the two queens, often painted as a tragic sisterhood, was in truth a rivalry edged in steel. Letters passed between them, sometimes warm, sometimes wary, but beneath the words lay distrust. Each woman knew that the other's existence threatened her own crown. The years that followed Mary's return to Scotland became a descent into intrigue, betrayal, and blood. Her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, once hailed as a strengthening of her Tudor claim, unraveled into disaster. Darnley's arrogance, drunkenness, and lust for power made him despised by nobles and dangerous to Mary herself. The murder of her secretary, David Rizzio, before her very eyes in 1566 shocked the realm, an act carried out by conspirators with Darnley's complicity. Mary, pregnant with the future, James VI, endured the humiliation with resilience, but her throne was shaken. Then came Darnley's own death. In 1567, his house blown apart in an explosion, his body found strangled in the orchard. Suspicion fell immediately upon James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who, astonishingly, married Mary weeks later. To her enemies, this was proof of guilt, a queen complicit in her husband's murder. To her allies, it was desperate miscalculation, a bid for protection in a kingdom spiraling beyond her control. But perception is often more powerful than truth. The scandal destroyed her reputation, and rebellion surged. Captured at Carberry Hill, imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle, Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son James VI. The queen who had worn her crown from 6 days old now found it stripped from her head. She escaped, raised an army, but defeat at Langside in 1568 drove her into exile. Seeking refuge in England, she placed herself at the mercy of Elizabeth, a fatal decision. For 19 years she lived in England, a prisoner more than a guest, her presence a perpetual threat to Elizabeth's rule. Plots rose around her name, rebellions invoked her claim, and though she denied involvement, suspicion clung to her like a shadow. At last, in 1587, the patience of Elizabeth broke. Mary was tried for treason, condemned, and led to the scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle. Accounts of her final moments tell of a queen who met death with composure and dignity, clad in crimson beneath her black gown, the colour of martyrdom. She knelt, prayed, and submitted to the executioner's blade. With the fall of the axe, the life that had begun in a cradle of power ended in a pool of blood. And yet, Mary's story did not end there. Her son, James VI of Scotland, would in 1603 inherit the English crown as James I, uniting the two kingdoms for which his mother had suffered. In death, Mary achieved what in life she could not: the union of crowns, the fusion of realms divided by centuries of conflict. Her reign, begun in infancy, ended in tragedy, but her legacy shaped the future of Britain. Thus, the tale of Mary, Queen of Scots, reminds us of the cruel paradox of monarchy, that crowns are given before understanding, burdens placed upon shoulders too small to bear. She was queen before she could speak, sovereign before she could stand, and a prisoner long before her death. Hers was a life of brilliance and ruin, of beauty and betrayal, of destiny written before she drew her first breath.